A few words about you. Dan Epp-Tiessen, longtime Old Testament prof and theology prof here at CMU. Various of you, I'm sure, have heard him speak at conferences or events in your churches. And recent publication of his is in the Believer's Church Commentary series, a book on Micah, Joel, and Obadiah. Every time I meet with Dan to visit or I hear him speak, he speaks with heart, with a profundity of care and love. So it's a delight to have you teach us this afternoon. Thanks.
Wow. Applause even before I start. That's you're in way too easy crowd, folks. Well, it's a joy to be with you and an honor to be asked to lead a Bible study at this event. And the title of my reflection is Moses and Elijah, Call and Recall. And I want to explore two Old Testament stories. One, the call of Moses, the other, the recall of the prophet Elijah. And I'm not going to suggest that my observations about these stories should somehow be prescriptive for you and your life, but I'm just going to throw out a number of observations about these stories and trust that somewhere along the way, you might find some insight and nourishment for your life, your faith journey, and your ministry. One of the most important things about the call of Moses is the context. In Exodus chapters 1-2, Pharaoh is alarmed at how the Israelite people are multiplying, and so he tries to address that by, first of all, enslaving the Israelites, and then decreeing that every Israelite male baby should be thrown into the Nile River. And Exodus never mentions God's involvement in the story until the very end of chapter 2. The Israelites groaned under their slavery, and they cried out, and out of their slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. This statement is the turning point in the story, because God has kind of been in the shadows, but now God steps center stage, and God is going to intervene in a big way. Here we go. And God's first act of intervention will be to intervene in the life of Moses and to interrupt his life as a shepherd of sheep and goats and turn him into a shepherd of God's people. Now, you may know the details of Moses' story. As a baby, his family hides him among the rushes of the Nile River, but Pharaoh's daughter finds him, adopts him, and he is raised in Pharaoh's court. But he never loses his sense of identity and his solidarity with his own people. And so as a young adult, when he sees a cruel Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, Moses intervenes and he kills that Egyptian. But when you kill one of Pharaoh's officials, that's an act of revolt. And when Moses hears that, okay, the word is out there about what he's done, he knows he's got to flee. So he heads for the Sinai desert. And through amazing luck, or maybe not entirely luck, he ends up at a well, meets the 7 daughters of the local priest, gets invited home for supper, and in short order, he has a wife, a son, a new extended family, and a job. And he's doing rather well for himself, given the circumstances. And the call of Moses is a rather dramatic story. One day he's out at work, and there's this blazing bush, flames blazing out of this bush, and yet the bush is not burned up. And when Moses approaches, he hears God's direct voice, "I am the God of your ancestors." And this call will shake Moses to the core of his being, and it will set him on a totally different life path than he is anticipating. But from God's perspective in the story, this call of Moses, it's not so much about Moses at all. It's about God's agenda and God's purposes. And God's purposes center on the Israelite people and the liberation of these people. And that's why God calls Moses, because some very important things on God's agenda need doing. And just listen to God's speech to Moses. The Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them. I will bring them out to the land of milk and honey. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me, and I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. A long I speech. And after that long I speech, we would expect God to follow up. And now here's what I'm going to do about all this stuff that I have seen and noticed. But here's how God, in fact, follows up. I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God's follow-up is, Moses, you go and you do it. You lead these people out of bondage. This move by God lands us smack in the middle of a great biblical paradox. One half of this paradox is that God is God, and therefore God's plans and purposes will move ahead no matter what. And it doesn't matter how powerful, how stubborn Pharaoh is, how many troops and how many chariots he has. God is God. God's plans and purposes will move ahead. But God needs Moses, because God often works through human beings. And so God needs Moses to go back to Egypt, to confront Pharaoh, to lead the Israelite people out of bondage, to instill some faith in these fearful and doubting Israelites. Because God chooses often to work through human agents, there are important things on God's agenda that don't get done if people like Moses don't respond faithfully to God's call. And as pastors and church leaders, we carry out our ministry right smack in the middle of this great paradox. God is God. The church belongs to God. It's God's project. God does the saving, and it's not all up to us. But on the other hand, there are very important agenda items, very important things in the life of the church, in the life of individual believers and seekers and non-believers, important things that won't get done if we don't heed our call, if we don't carry out our ministry faithfully, consistently, competently, with love, understanding, determination, commitment, and compassion. And the first half of the paradox can help keep us humble about ourselves and our efforts. Because God is God, it's not all about us and our efforts. Not everything depends upon us and what we do. And we can relax and we can rest in God and in the project. And the church is God's project. The other half of the paradox challenges us to take our call and our ministry with utmost seriousness. Many important things on God's agenda are not going to get done unless we are faithful in carrying out the daily tasks of our ministry. But getting back to God and Moses. For Moses, it's an ordinary day on the job until God shows up and interrupts. With God's startling words, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. And Moses' humble response is totally understandable. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Indeed, who am I? Moses knows firsthand Pharaoh's power and Pharaoh's oppressive system. Who am I is Moses' humble acknowledgement that he's not up for the task. And who is ever fully up for the task? The ministry that God calls us to. And there's something appropriate about a humble response to God's call. Think about the alternative. Do we really want Moses or somebody today who has a sense of God's call to respond with, "Oh God, I'm certainly glad you got the right person here. And I'm glad you knocked. I'm all set to go, so let's just get on with it. I'm raring to go." Much more appropriate to respond with, "Who am I? Who am I?" In the face of the challenges, the obstacles, the disappointments that will inevitably come, who am I? God responds in two different ways to Moses' "Who am I?" God promises, "I will be with you." So much tied up in those words. I will be with you. The ministry I'm calling you to, it's my project. And so I will be with you. I will walk with you every step of the way. You will never find yourself alone because I will be with you. When challenges come, you will find sources of strength, encouragement, and resilience that you never knew that you could draw on because I will be with you. When you have doubts and fears and anxieties, I will be with you. And in your ministry, you will find deep joy and fulfillment because I will be with you. The second part of God's response to Moses' "Who am I?" is the promise of a sign. But it's a very odd sign. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. That's the sign, right? Yeah. How helpful is that in this moment, right? A little bit later, God will give Moses a serious sign. Throw your staff on the ground and it becomes a poisonous snake. Grabs it by the tail, it turns back into a staff. Now that's the kind of sign we can get our heads around. But it's probably not the kind of sign that most of us here have had. But the first sign that God gives Moses, that's more like the kind of sign that we too get, I think. The sign that God has in fact called Moses to lead the Israelites is observed in the impact of his ministry and leadership. When he leads the Israelites out of Egypt and they come to this mountain and they serve and they worship God, that's the sign that Moses' call is genuine. The sign is not that Moses' ministry will always be a perfect success. We know that during the Exodus journey, the Israelites were consistently prone to complaining, rebellion, faithlessness. But with Moses' persistent leadership and help, there is some level of faith that develops among the Israelites, and they do worship God, and they do commit to the covenant that God offers them at Sinai, and they do donate generously to build a tabernacle that will house God's presence among them, and that will be the focal point of their worship. And they do agree to live by God's guidelines, even though they don't always follow through on that commitment. Israel's worship and service of God is the sign that the call of Moses is genuine. And perhaps that's how it is for us also. Our call is verified when, partly as a result of our ministry and our efforts, people are led out of bondage. They experience newfound freedom. Their lives are changed as they come to know God's life-giving ways. And as they commit themselves to God, and as they freely and joyfully worship the God that liberates them, and they serve this God with their lives. Even though this worship and service may not always be as sincere and thorough and consistent as we and God would like it to be. The kind of sign that God gives Moses can't be known in advance. It can only be known and experienced in the daily life of ministry. The story of Moses' call continues for a whole additional chapter yet, as Moses mounts one opposition, one excuse after the other of why he shouldn't be the one to go, and God responds to each excuse until all that Moses can do is just sputter out, "Just send somebody else." And God says, "Nope, you're the one that's going. But I'm sending you Aaron to help you out, to cover for some of your personal shortcomings. And there's so much more that could and should be said about the call of Moses, but just one final observation. Moses heeds God's call only after a whole lot of kicking and screaming and resisting. But once Moses yields to the call, he never looks back. And he is faithful to the end. Unlike the great prophet Elijah. Unlike Elijah. The Bible doesn't provide us with a call story for Elijah, but it does tell us about how Elijah gives up on his call and gives up on his ministry and decides to pack it in. Now, Elijah, somewhat of an unlikely candidate for needing a recall story. How can a prophet who publicly, courageously confronts the wicked king Ahab, how can a prophet like that need a recall? Or how can a prophet who on Mount Carmel single-handedly squares off against the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, and then publicly demonstrates that Yahweh is the true God of Israel because he can call down fire from heaven that consumes the sacrifice and the entire altar? How can a prophet like that need a recall? And the Bible doesn't really tell us about what drives Elijah into the pit of despair after this great success on Mount Carmel. But the next time we meet him after this event, he is in rough shape. When Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, finds out that Elijah has killed the prophets that she's been sponsoring, she sends a messenger to threaten Elijah with execution. And the previously courageous Elijah flees for his life, far, far south to the edge of the desert, leaves his servant behind in Beersheba, sort of the last town, human settlement before it becomes barren desert. And then he walks a whole day's journey south, even deeper into the hostile wilderness, sits down under a bush, and he asked that he might die. "It's enough now, O Lord, take away my life," he blurts out. Elijah has abandoned his calling, his prophetic ministry, and he even wants to die. Elijah may be done with God and doing God's work, but God's not done with Elijah yet. And so God's recall begins. While Elijah is sleeping under that bush, suddenly a malak, a messenger, it gets translated angel, messenger is a much better term. Suddenly a messenger touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." And he looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. For a prophet who wants to pack it in and die, God sends a messenger with food and water. Exactly what a person needs to survive in the harsh wilderness. But it will take more than just food and water to recall Elijah, illustrated by the fact that he immediately lies back down and falls asleep. But God's messenger is persistent. The messenger of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you." What journey? He got up and he ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. That journey to Horeb, that's Mount Sinai. The mountain that is forever in Israelite tradition associated with God's presence. It's where God called Moses. It's where God met the Israelite people during the Exodus. It's where God entered into a covenant relationship with them. It's the mountain from which God's Torah was delivered, the set of guidelines for faithful living. Elijah's recall involves a journey to the core of Israel's faith traditions. Down Mount Horeb, Elijah holds up in a cave where God says to him, "Elijah, what are you doing here?" Now, on one hand, it can hardly be the wrong thing to do for a burnt-out, discouraged prophet to make a trip to the heart of Israel's faith, especially when it was God's messenger who suggested the trip and provided the food and water to make it possible. But ultimately, at least in the long term, prophets don't belong on the top of mountains communing with God, as important as that is to do from time to time. Prophets belong in the world, doing God's work. And in response to God's question, Elijah, what are you doing here? Elijah toots his own horn. I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars. They've killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left. And they're seeking my life to take it away. Now, here we get a glimpse into some of the reasons for Elijah's burnout. He has become overly pessimistic about the life of God's people. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant. In the previous story, after the people see God's fire come down from heaven, they declare, Yahweh indeed is God. The Israelites have killed your prophets, Elijah declares. That's not quite true either, Elijah. Queen Jezebel tried to kill God's prophets, but the previous chapter tells us that there was a palace insider who took it upon himself to hide 100 of God's prophets, 50 to a cave, and he made sure that they got food and water. Elijah says, they're seeking my life too. No, they're not, Elijah. It's Ahab and Jezebel that may be seeking your life, but not the Israelite people as a whole. When we face challenges in our ministry, it's easy to get into a negative funk like Elijah does. Everything's going wrong. The church is a mess. People don't care. No one is faithful around here anymore. I'm the only faithful one left, and everything depends upon me. And does that sound familiar? Amen. Oh, yeah, I got an amen. Yeah, okay. And now they're out to get me. Well, no, we won't go there. Interestingly, God doesn't respond specifically to Elijah's self-serving tooting of his own horn. God just says, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, because the Lord will pass by. Standing before God can sometimes help us get perspective on things. Well, some of you know how the story proceeds. First comes a rock-shattering wind, and then an earthquake, and then a fire. But unlike other biblical stories where God is present precisely in such dramatic phenomena, in this story, God's not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire. God speaks through a thin, small voice. And through this thin, small voice, God again asks Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah repeats verbatim his self-promoting words from before. And again, God essentially ignores Elijah's self-promoting words, and God simply responds by recalling Elijah. Elijah, return to the world. Return to your prophetic ministry of acting as my representative and my spokesperson. And here's what I want you to do. Go and anoint these political leaders. And go and anoint your prophetic successor, the young Elisha, so that there will be somebody to carry on the prophetic ministry when you're no longer around. And then God reminds Elijah, there are 7,000 people in Israel who are faithful. They've never worshiped any other God but me. 7,000. It's the perfect number in Hebrew, right? 7, the number of completion, perfection. 7,000, it's a remnant, but it's a complete and a perfect remnant. Elijah, not everything depends upon you. There's another faith, there's a big faithful remnant that God will work with. The final scene in 1 Kings 19 is Elijah sets off to find Elisha, anoints him as his prophetic successor, and then Elisha follows Elijah as the older prophet begins to mentor his young protege. And Elijah's energetic return to the world and his ministry illustrate his recall is now complete. In ministry, there can be many good reasons to become pessimistic, discouraged, and burnt out. People in the church are not as faithful, always as they should be. Sometimes people do forsake the covenant. They stop caring about God and the things of God, and they may reject God's messengers. And sometimes it does feel as if way too much rests on our shoulders. And it's easy to feel that we are the only ones who really care, who are really committed. And sometimes we too might benefit from a recall. The story of Elijah's recall may assure us that during our times of weariness, discouragement, God may show up in the form of a messenger with water and food. A pilgrimage to the core of our faith tradition is always a possibility. And there we may find God present, and there God may speak to us in that thin, small voice, calling us to return to our ministry. Go back into the world, back into the church, back into your ministry. Get back to the tasks to which I've called you. Get back to doing the work that's on God's agenda. And perhaps, most important of all, we may hear the same reassuring words that God spoke to Moses. I will be with you. I will be with you. I will be with you. May it be so.